Civilizations do not collapse. They run a program, a specific, repeatable, 4-generation program that was written down in 1377 by a man you were never told about, tested against 600 societies by a scientist most historians refuse to take seriously, and confirmed by a prediction published in Nature in 2010 that came true on schedule. In 2020, the program does not require war. It does not require famine. It requires success. Success is the input. Collapse is the output. You were taught that civilizations fall for unique reasons. Rome was decadent. The Soviets were ideological. The British were overextended. You were taught that each collapse was its own story, its own set of mistakes, its own failure of leadership. That framing is comfortable. It is also wrong. There is an equation. It has 3 terms. It has been tested against 2,000 years of data. And right now, every variable in that equation, for the country you are probably sitting in, is in the red, not approaching the red, in it. Tonight I want to walk you slowly and carefully through a 14th century scholar named Ibn Khaldun, writing alone in a castle in Algeria after losing everything. Through the 4-generation cycle, he discovered in the ruins of North African dynasties, through a population biologist named Peter Turchin, who translated that cycle into mathematics and predicted 2020, a decade before it happened, through the 5 American data tracks that match the late-stage profile on every single variable, and through the 300 historical crises that tell you with 75% reliability what comes next. Settle in for this one. Subscribe if you haven't, and stay to the end, because the question you clicked for, whether the pattern can be broken, has an answer in the data. You are not going to like it. Let's get into it. In 2010, a man named Peter Turchin published a single paragraph in Nature, volume 463, page 608, February 4th, 2010. The paragraph was short. It said that the United States, along with Western Europe, was entering a period of growing political instability, and that the instability would peak around 2020. He named the specific forces driving it: declining real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, an overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees who had no path to the positions they had been trained to fill, exploding public debt. He said these forces had spiked before in American history roughly every 50 years, around 1870, around 1920, around 1970, and that the next spike was due around 2020. Nobody took him seriously. He was a population biologist at the University of Connecticut, not a political scientist, not a historian, not an economist. He was applying the mathematics of ecology, the equations used to predict population crashes in insect colonies, to human civilizations. And most of the people who read that paragraph in Nature either ignored it or quietly assumed the man was out of his depth. Then 2020 arrived. A global pandemic killed over 1 million Americans. Anti-government demonstrations and riots spiked to levels not seen since the late 1960s. An insurrection stormed the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. Political violence, which had been declining through the 2000s, reversed course and surged exactly when the model said it would. And Turchin, watching the data come in, did not look like a man who had been proven right. He looked like a man who had hoped he was wrong. He told Time magazine that people had no reason to believe he was not crazy back in 2010. But the numbers did not care whether people believed. They arrived on schedule. They always arrive on schedule. I spent an unreasonable amount of time with Turchin's work over the past several months, and with the work of the man he credits as his intellectual ancestor. Because Turchin did not invent the model. He inherited it. He translated it into equations. He tested it against data. And he published a prediction that turned out to be correct. But the model itself, the underlying logic, the specific mechanism by which civilizations rise, consolidate, decay, and collapse, was written down 647 years ago, in 1377, by a North African scholar named Ibn Khaldun, in a castle, alone, after watching every civilization he had ever served collapse around him, one after another, following a pattern so consistent that he stopped believing it was coincidence and started believing it was law. The book he wrote is called the Muqaddimah. It is, by any reasonable measure, the most important work of social science produced before the modern era. Arnold Toynbee, the British historian who spent 12 volumes trying to explain why civilizations rise and fall, called it the greatest work of its kind ever created by any mind in any time or place. That is a direct quote from Toynbee, the greatest work of its kind ever created. And the odds are very good that you have never heard of it. The odds are very good that the name Ibn Khaldun means nothing to you, that the concept at the center of his theory, a concept called Asabiyyah, is a word you have never encountered, and that the specific algorithm he identified, the 4-generation cycle by which group cohesion builds, peaks, decays, and destroys the civilization it created, is something that was never mentioned in any history class you ever took. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. It is not that Khaldun's model was disproven. It was not. It is not that modern scholarship found flaws in his reasoning. If anything, modern scholarship has made his case stronger. The reason you were never taught this is that the idea itself, the idea that civilizations follow a predictable cycle of decay that operates independently of the decisions made by the people inside them, is so uncomfortable to the Western intellectual tradition that it was easier to simply pretend the book did not exist for 400 years. And in that time, every single thing he predicted about how civilizations die has continued to happen, including, if the data is right now, including to you. There is a number I need to plant here before we go any further, because it is going to matter later, and I want you to remember it. Turchin's research group has catalogued roughly 300 historical crises, periods where the structural conditions he measures tipped a society into instability. Of those 300 crises, 75% ended in revolution or civil war. 60% ended in the death of the state. Not reform, not recovery. The state ceased to exist. 75% and 60%. Hold those numbers. The story of how that model was discovered, buried, rediscovered, translated into mathematics, and confirmed by data starts in the summer of 1332, in a city on the coast of North Africa, with a boy who was about to lose everything. Ibn Khaldun was born on the 27th of May, 1332, in Tunis. His family, the Banu Khaldun, were Andalusian Arabs. They had lived in Seville for generations, part of the intellectual and political aristocracy of Muslim Spain, until the Reconquista pushed south and made it clear that Seville would not remain Muslim much longer. The family fled sometime in the 13th century, resettled in Ifriqiya, which is roughly modern Tunisia, and established themselves in the Hafsid court. By the time Ibn Khaldun was born, the family had been in North Africa for over a century. They were educated, connected, and politically active. His father was a scholar and administrator. His childhood, by the standards of 14th century North Africa, was privileged. Then the Black Death arrived. In 1348, the plague swept across the Mediterranean and into North Africa. Khaldun himself described its scale in the Muqaddimah, with a detachment that reads, 6 centuries later, like the controlled voice of a man who has processed something too large for emotion. Civilization both in the East and the West, he wrote, was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. It overtook the dynasties at the time of their senility, when they had reached the limit of their duration. Cities and buildings were laid waste, roads and way signs were obliterated, settlements and mansions became empty. Dynasties and tribes grew weak. He was describing the collapse of his own world in the voice of someone documenting a geological event, which is, in retrospect, exactly what he would later argue it was. The plague killed both of his parents. It killed most of his teachers. It killed, by some estimates, 1/3 of the population of the Maghreb and more than 1/3 of Europe. Khaldun was 17 years old, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, because this is not incidental biography. This is formative in a way that connects directly to everything he later wrote. A 17-year-old boy watched his entire world, his family, his teachers, the social infrastructure that was supposed to carry him into adulthood, dissolve in a matter of months. Not because of war, not because of political failure, but because of a force that operated on civilizations regardless of their choices, regardless of their strength, regardless of their intentions. The world he had been raised to inhabit simply ceased to exist. The educational system that would have produced his generation of scholars was gutted. The courts that would have employed him were emptied. The entire professional class of Tunis was decimated. And this boy, orphaned, surrounded by death, had to build a new understanding of how things worked from the wreckage. I think about that a lot. I think about what it does to a person's intellectual framework. When at 17, you learn that the world can simply stop. Not slow down, not decline. Stop. The kind of mind that responds to that by seeking a law, an explanation that removes the randomness and replaces it with mechanism, is the kind of mind that produces the Muqaddimah. Khaldun did not want comfort. He wanted a formula. And he spent the next 3 decades gathering the data he would need to write one. He entered politics young. By 20, he was serving as a seal-bearer to the Hafsid Sultan Abu Ishaq. By 22, he had moved to Fez, the intellectual capital of the Maghreb, serving the Marinid Sultan Abu Inan. And this is where the pattern started. The pattern that would define his life and, eventually, his theory. Abu Inan suspected Khaldun of conspiracy. In February of 1357, Khaldun was arrested and thrown in prison. He spent 21 months locked up. When Abu Inan died and Khaldun was released, he immediately began serving the next ruler, and then the next, and then the next. Over the following 2 decades, Khaldun served sultans in Fez, in Tlemcen, in Bugis, in Granada. He was a diplomat, an advisor, a judge. He led a diplomatic mission to Pedro the Cruel of Castile. He negotiated between warring dynasties, and through all of it, he watched the same thing happen over and over. A ruler would take power on the strength of tribal loyalty and military cohesion. He would consolidate. His court would grow wealthy. His sons or grandsons would grow comfortable. The tribal bonds that had put the dynasty in power would weaken as luxury replaced hardship. The rulers would rely increasingly on mercenaries and paid soldiers instead of kinsmen who fought out of loyalty. Taxation would increase to pay for the growing court and the hired army. The people would grow resentful. And then a new group, from the desert or the mountains, hungry and cohesive and bound together by exactly the solidarity that the ruling dynasty had lost, would sweep in and take everything. He watched this happen to the Marinids. He watched it happen to the Hafsids. He watched it happen to the Nasrids in Granada. And each time, the people inside the collapsing dynasty believed their situation was unique. They believed the forces acting on them were specific to their circumstances, their enemies, their particular failures of leadership. Khaldun watched and saw something different. He saw the same mechanism repeating itself with the regularity of a natural process. And that word, natural, is critical, because what made Khaldun's insight different from every historian before him was that he refused to treat the rise and fall of civilizations as a moral story. It was not about good rulers and bad rulers. It was not about sin and divine punishment. It was, he argued, a structural process that operated on human societies the way physical forces operate on physical systems. It was a law. In 1374, his closest friend, the polymath and statesman Ibn al-Khatib, was arrested in Fez and executed. The charges were heresy, but the real reason was politics. Ibn al-Khatib had served the Nasrid court in Granada and had made enemies. The execution was ordered by the same political machinery that Khaldun had spent his career navigating. And something in Khaldun broke. Not emotionally, though there was that too. Intellectually, he looked at the system he had spent 20 years inside and decided that the system itself was the subject, not the individuals who moved through it, not the specific grievances or alliances or betrayals. The system, the algorithm, the recurring pattern that ground up even the most brilliant people who tried to operate within it. In 1375, he left politics entirely. He requested protection from the Oulad Arif tribe and retreated to the castle of Khalat ibn Salama near modern Frenda in Algeria. And there, in isolation, over the next 4 years, he wrote the Muqaddimah. He later said the first draft took him 5 months. That may have been an exaggeration in the direction of modesty, or it may not have been. Either way, the text he produced was unlike anything that had ever existed in any language. It was not a history, it was a theory of history. He called it a new science, Ilm al-Umran, the science of civilization. And at its center was a single concept that explained, in his analysis, every rise and fall he had ever witnessed. Asabiyyah. The word does not translate cleanly into English. It has been rendered as group feeling, social solidarity, social cohesion, tribal consciousness, and collective will. None of those are quite right. Asabiyyah is the force that makes a group of people willing to sacrifice their individual interests for the collective. It is the bond that makes a soldier fight for his tribe rather than flee. It is the loyalty that makes a merchant extend credit to his kinsman without a contract. It is the shared identity that makes a people governable, not by force, but by mutual recognition that they are, in some essential sense, the same. And Khaldun's claim, the claim that sits at the center of everything, is that Asabiyyah is not permanent. It is generated under specific conditions, it peaks, and then it decays. And the decay follows a pattern so consistent that he was willing to call it a law of human civilization. He wrote it plainly. Dynasties have a natural lifespan like individuals. Not as metaphor, as diagnosis, the cycle, as he described it, runs approximately 4 generations, roughly 120 years. He compared it to what the astrologers of his era called the Great Lunar Year, which is a mathematical rather than mystical reference, a way of saying that the cycle has a characteristic period, the way a pendulum has a characteristic period. He mapped it in stages, though different scholars count the stages slightly differently. The version that captures it best runs like this. The first generation is the generation of conquest. A group living on the margins, in the desert, in the mountains, on the frontier, develops strong Asabiyyah through shared hardship. They are bound together by necessity. They fight together. They starve together. They survive together. This cohesion gives them military power that far exceeds what their numbers would suggest, because every member of the group is genuinely willing to die for the others. When they encounter a settled civilization whose own Asabiyyah has decayed, they conquer it. Not because they are more numerous or better armed, but because they are more willing. Khaldun observed this with clinical precision. He noted that desert peoples, with their constant exposure to danger and scarcity, develop courage and self-reliance that city dwellers cannot match. He noted that this courage is not individual, but collective. It is the product of a group that knows at the level of instinct that no member can survive alone. The second generation inherits the conquest. They did not build the solidarity. They received it. They know the stories of hardship. They respect the values of the founding generation. But they did not live them. They consolidate. They build institutions. They centralize authority. The leader moves from being first among equals to being a sovereign. Bureaucracy replaces tribal council. This is necessary. You cannot run a civilization on informal kinship bonds alone. But the shift from kinship to bureaucracy is also the first crack, because bureaucracy does not require Asabiyyah. It requires obedience, and obedience, without the underlying solidarity that makes obedience voluntary, eventually requires force. The third generation knows only luxury. They have no memory of the desert. The hardship stories are legends, not lived experience. They have grown up in palaces, surrounded by wealth that they did not create and cannot imagine losing. Khaldun wrote about this generation with a specificity that suggests he had watched it happen in real time, which of course he had, many times over. As the toughness of desert life is lost, he wrote, group feeling and courage weaken. Members of the tribe revel in the well-being that God has given them. Their children and offspring grow up too proud to look after themselves or to attend to their own needs. They have disdain also for all the other things that are necessary in connection with group feeling. Their loyalty is to their own comfort, not to the group. They hire mercenaries because they will not fight. They delegate governance because they find it tedious. They spend lavishly because they have never known scarcity. And the ruler, who in the first generation was sustained by the voluntary loyalty of his kinsmen, must now buy loyalty with money and enforce it with coercion. Taxation increases. The people who are being taxed receive less and less in return. Trust between the rulers and the ruled begins to collapse. The fourth generation is the generation of senility. They retain the form of authority without its substance. They sit on thrones. They issue decrees. But the decrees are enforced by hired men who have no loyalty to the dynasty beyond their paycheck. The treasury is strained because taxation has been pushed to its limit, and revenue is declining even as rates increase. Group feeling disappears completely. Khaldun wrote, people forget to protect and defend themselves and to press their claims. For the most part, they are more cowardly than women upon their backs. That last phrase is Khaldun at his most clinical. He is not moralizing. He is describing a measurable decline in collective capacity. A society that once fought with cohesive ferocity has become a society that cannot organize a defense of its own borders. Khaldun wrote one of the most quoted lines in economic history about the fiscal dimension of this exact phenomenon. At the beginning of a dynasty, he wrote, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of a dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments. Ronald Reagan quoted that line in the 1980s when discussing supply-side economics and the Laffer curve, which tells you something about how far the line traveled and how little context traveled with it. Reagan was citing the observation without acknowledging the framework. He was using the symptom without diagnosing the disease. And then, somewhere on the margins, a new group with fresh Asabiyyah looks at the decaying dynasty and sees an opportunity. And the cycle resets. Khaldun did not present this as speculation. He presented it as observable law, verified against every dynasty he had personally studied. And the specifics of his case studies are worth walking through because they show how precisely the algorithm operates when you trace it through actual history. The Almoravids, Saharan Sanhaja Berbers, living in the Western Sahara, bound together by a harsh reformist interpretation of Islam, preached by the legal scholar Abdallah ibn Yassin. They were the first generation incarnate desert hardship, religious solidarity, military ferocity. Under Yusuf ibn Tashfin, they conquered Marrakesh in 1062, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and took Muslim Spain by 1090. Within a generation, the Almoravid court in Marrakesh was a center of luxury, art, and Andalusian culture. The desert warriors, who had swept across North Africa on the strength of their collective discipline, were now patrons of musicians and poets. Their sons dressed in silk, their grandsons hired mercenaries. And in 1147, the Almohads, a new group with fresh Asabiyyah, swept down from the Atlas Mountains and destroyed them. 91 years from founding to displacement. 3 generations. The Almohads, Atlas Mountain Mazmuda Berbers, united by the reformist theology of Ibn Tumat, who declared himself the Mahdi and launched a puritanical revolt against Almoravid decadence. They were, in Khaldun's framework, the next iteration of the same cycle. The men from the mountains replacing the men from the desert, who had themselves replaced the men who came before. They peaked under Yaqub al-Mansur, who defeated the Castilians at Alarcos in 1195. But their grandson, Muhammad al-Nasir, was catastrophically defeated at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, a defeat that broke the dynasty's military prestige and opened the way for Berber tribes in the provinces to assert independence. 148 years from founding to effective dissolution. 4 generations, exactly as the model predicts. And the Marinids, Zenata Berbers who ruled Morocco from Fez starting around 1244. Khaldun served them personally. He watched the 3rd and 4th generation of the Marinid dynasty from the inside, watching the luxury, the hired armies, the fiscal overextension, the growing gap between the court and the countryside. He was not theorizing from a distance. He was taking notes while the building burned. Each dynasty following the same arc. Desert discipline to urban luxury to hired armies to collapse. Each dynasty's members believing their problems were unique, none of them seeing the pattern. And Khaldun, watching from inside, serving as judge and advisor and prisoner and exile, accumulated enough data points to see what none of the people living inside the cycles could see. The pattern was not unique. The pattern was the point. And I want to stop here and make sure you understand what makes this different from every other theory of civilizational decline you have ever encountered. Khaldun is not saying that empires fall because their leaders become corrupt. He is not saying they fall because of external invasion. He is not saying they fall because God punishes the wicked. He is saying that the success of a civilization is what destroys it. The very cohesion that allows a group to conquer and build also creates the conditions, wealth, comfort, safety, that dissolve the cohesion. It is a structural trap. The civilization does not fail because it did something wrong. It fails because it did everything right, and doing everything right is what kills it. That is not a moral argument. That is a thermodynamic one. Asabiyyah dissipates the way heat dissipates from a system. Not because of a flaw, because of a law. And I want to push on this thermodynamic analogy, because I think it is the key to understanding why Khaldun's model is so different from every Western theory of decline, and why it was so threatening to the Western intellectual tradition. In thermodynamics, the second law says that entropy in a closed system always increases. Order decays into disorder. Hot things cool down. Concentrated energy disperses. You can temporarily reverse the process locally by pumping energy in from outside. But the overall trend is irreversible. Khaldun is describing something analogous in social systems. Asabiyyah is concentrated social energy. It is order. It is the improbable state in which a group of individuals subordinates their self-interest to the collective. And like all improbable states, it is unstable. It decays. The decay is not caused by moral failure or bad leadership or external shock. It is caused by the passage of time and the accumulation of success. Every comfort reduces the hardship that generated the cohesion. Every luxury makes the next generation less willing to sacrifice. Every bureaucratic efficiency replaces a bond of loyalty with a transactional relationship. And you cannot reverse this by wishing it reversed. You can only reverse it by reintroducing the conditions that generated the cohesion in the first place, which means reintroducing hardship, scarcity, and existential threat. And no one chooses that voluntarily. This is why Khaldun's model was so incompatible with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment said that progress could be sustained indefinitely through reason, education, and institutional design. Khaldun said that progress is a phase in a cycle, not a direction. The Enlightenment said that good institutions prevent decay. Khaldun said that institutions are built by cohesive people and inherited by people who mistake the institution for the cohesion, not understanding that the institution is the form and the cohesion is the substance, and that the form survives the substance only briefly. Think about that in the context of your own country, whichever country that is. Think about the institutions that your parents or grandparents' generation built. Think about whether you trust those institutions the way they did. Think about whether you would sacrifice for them the way the generation that built them sacrificed. And if the answer is no, as it is for most people listening to this right now, then you are living inside Khaldun's third or fourth generation. And you are living proof that the algorithm works. But here is where the story takes a turn that Khaldun himself could not have anticipated, because if his theory had remained where he left it, as a qualitative observation about North African dynasties, it would be an interesting artifact of medieval intellectual history, a curiosity, something scholars mention in footnotes and move past. What happened instead is that 600 years later, someone translated it into mathematics, tested it against a dataset covering more than 600 societies across 10,000 years of human history, and found that the algorithm works. Before we get to that though, you need to understand the gap, the silence, because the silence itself is part of the story, and it tells you something important about why you were never taught this. Khaldun finished the Muqaddimah in 1377. He left the castle. He moved to Cairo in 1382, where the Mamluk Sultan Barkuk made him a professor and later chief Maliki judge. And in 1384, the ship carrying his wife and daughters from Tunis to join him in Cairo sank off the coast of Alexandria. Everyone aboard drowned, his entire family gone. Think about that. A man who spent his life studying the impersonal forces that destroy civilizations lost his own family to an impersonal force. The sea did not care about his theory. It did not care about his grief. It operated the way forces operate, indifferent to the meaning that human beings attach to the things they destroy. And Khaldun, in his autobiography, records the loss in a single devastating line. He writes that no one survived. That is all. No one survived. And then he continued his work. In 1401, 17 years after losing his family, Khaldun found himself inside the besieged city of Damascus. The Mamluk Sultan Faraj had brought an army to defend Damascus against Tamerlane, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who had already burned his way across Persia, Central Asia, India, and Anatolia, leaving pyramids of skulls outside the cities he razed. Tamerlane was not a barbarian in the sense that the word implies lack of sophistication. He was a scholar of the Quran, a patron of architecture, a chess player of reportedly frightening skill. He was also responsible for the deaths of an estimated 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's population at the time. He was, in the most literal possible sense, the man from the margins. Born into a minor Turkic Mongol clan near Samarkand, he had built an empire through military genius and the kind of ferocious Asabiyyah that Khaldun had spent his career theorizing about. Sultan Faraj, young and frightened by reports of a revolt brewing back in Cairo, abandoned the campaign and retreated to Egypt, leaving Damascus to fend for itself. Khaldun stayed. He was 69 years old. His family was dead. His career had consisted of serving dynasties that collapsed. And when it became clear that the city could not hold, he did something that would have been unthinkable for almost anyone else. He had himself lowered over the city walls in a basket, using ropes, and went to meet the most feared conqueror on earth. The meeting lasted 7 weeks. Walter Fischel translated Khaldun's account of it in 1952 from the autobiographical section of the Kitab al-Ibar, published by the University of California Press. The account is extraordinary. The two men discussed the geography of the Maghreb. Tamerlane wanted a detailed description of North Africa, and Khaldun provided one so thorough that he later wrote it up as a formal report. They discussed the reliability of the historian al-Tabari. They discussed the nature of the caliphate and who had legitimate claim to lead the Muslim world. And they discussed Asabiyyah, the world historian and the world conqueror, sitting across from each other outside a burning city, one of them explaining to the other the algorithm by which civilizations rise and fall, the other embodying it. I want you to imagine that scene. A 69-year-old man who has lost everything, his family, his friends, his faith in the systems he served, sitting across from a 74-year-old man who has conquered everything. The theorist and the phenomenon. The man who wrote the equation and the man who is the variable. Tamerlane was, in Khaldun's own framework, the first generation. The man with fresh Asabiyyah, the force that sweeps in when the settled civilization has decayed past the point of defending itself. And he knew it. According to Ibn Arabshah, another contemporary historian, Tamerlane was fascinated by Khaldun's theory, which is unsurprising because the theory explained his own success. It told him he was not an accident. He was a phase transition. Khaldun returned to Cairo. Tamerlane sacked Damascus. Khaldun died on March 17, 1406, at the age of 73. He had served 6 terms as chief judge. He had written 7 volumes of history. He had produced a theory of civilizational dynamics that would not be matched for complexity or predictive power for half a millennium. And within a generation of his death, the theory was functionally forgotten by the people who most needed it. Not entirely forgotten. Ottoman historians picked it up. Khatib Celebi in the 17th century, Mustafa Naima in the early 18th century, Ahmed Cevdet Pasha in the 19th, all used Khaldun's framework to analyze the Ottoman Empire's own trajectory. But in Western Europe, where the Enlightenment was building an entirely different model of history, one based on linear progress, reason, and the perfectibility of institutions, Khaldun was invisible. The first European mention of him was in Barthélemy d'Herbelot's Bibliothèque Orientale in 1697, and even that was just a passing reference. Sylvestre de Sacy published a partial translation and biographical essay in 1806. The full Arabic text was printed in Paris by Étienne Marc Quatremere in 1858. William Deslane's French translation appeared between 1862 and 1868, and Franz Rosenthal's definitive English translation did not arrive until 1958. The Muqaddimah was written in 1377 and was not available in English for 581 years. Think about what happened in those 581 years. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the birth of modern sociology with Comte, modern economics with Smith, modern political science with Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke, the publication of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, the most famous work on civilizational collapse in the English language, written by a man who apparently did not know that a North African scholar had already cracked the problem 4 centuries earlier. Every single one of those disciplines was working on questions that Khaldun had addressed, in many cases more rigorously, 4 to 5 centuries earlier. And none of them knew it. Robert Flint, the Scottish philosopher who wrote a survey of the philosophy of history in 1893, said that as a theorist on history, Khaldun had no equal in any age or country, until Vico appeared more than 300 years later, and that Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine were not his peers. That is not hyperbole. That is a professional assessment from a man who had read everything. And Flint was writing in 1893, 45 years before Toynbee's praise, 65 years before Rosenthal's translation would make the full text available in English. So why was he buried? The answer is not conspiracy. It is something more uncomfortable than conspiracy. It is the fact that the Western intellectual tradition from the Enlightenment onward was built on the assumption that history moves forward. That progress is the default, that civilizations learn, improve, and accumulate knowledge that protects them from the failures of the past. The Whig interpretation of history, the Hegelian dialectic moving toward the absolute, Marx's historical materialism moving toward the classless society, the liberal democratic assumption that institutions, once built, tend to strengthen over time. All of these frameworks share one premise. The arrow of history points up. Khaldun's model says the arrow points in a circle. It says civilizations are trapped in a cycle that their own success generates. It says progress is temporary, that the forces that build a civilization are the same forces that destroy it, and that the cycle repeats whether the people inside it recognize it or not. That is not a message that a civilization built on the ideology of progress wants to hear, especially not from a 14th century North African Muslim writing in Arabic. So it did not hear it. For 400 years, the West simply looked the other way, not out of malice, out of something worse, out of the deep structural incompatibility between Khaldun's conclusion and the story the West needed to tell itself about what it was. And I want to be explicit about the Eurocentrism here, because it matters. Khaldun was not some minor thinker who happened to be overlooked. He was, by the assessment of multiple Western scholars who eventually read him, the single most important theorist of history ever produced by human civilization. And he was invisible to Western scholarship for 400 years, because he wrote in Arabic, because he was Muslim, because he was North African, and because his conclusions were uncomfortable. That is not a neutral historical accident. That is a data point in its own right. It tells you something about the mechanisms by which civilizations avoid confronting the forces that are destroying them. They ignore the people who named those forces, especially when those people do not look like them. And then, in the early 2000s, a population biologist at the University of Connecticut picked up the Muqaddimah and recognized the algorithm for what it was. Peter Turchin was born in Russia in 1957. His father was the dissident physicist Valentin Turchin, who advocated for human rights and cybernetics, was fired from his position at the Moscow Institute for Physics and Technology, and was eventually exiled from the Soviet Union in 1977. The family moved to the United States. Peter trained as a zoologist at Moscow State University before the emigration, and then earned his PhD from Duke University in 1985, specializing in population dynamics, the mathematics of how animal populations grow, crash, and cycle. He published extensively on pine beetle outbreaks and predator-prey oscillations. He became a tenured professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Connecticut. He was, by any normal career trajectory, a successful entomologist with no obvious connection to the study of human history. And then, at some point in the late 1990s, he started asking a question that would derail his career in the best possible way. He started asking whether the same equations that predicted population crashes in beetle colonies could predict population crashes in civilizations. The parallel was not as absurd as it might sound. Population ecology deals with feedback loops, carrying capacity, resource competition, and the mathematics of collapse. Civilizations, Turchin reasoned, are populations of humans embedded in resource systems with finite carrying capacities. When the population outgrows the resources, or when the distribution of resources becomes sufficiently unequal, the system destabilizes. The math should be similar. And when he read Khaldun and then Goldstone, he realized that the math was not just similar, it was the same. This was not a popular question. Historians do not like equations. They do not like the word predict applied to human societies. They especially do not like the suggestion that human history follows laws, because laws imply that individual choices do not matter, and the entire discipline of history is built on the premise that choices matter. Turchin was told, politely and not so politely, that he was trespassing. He did not care. He had read Khaldun. He had read Jack Goldstone's 1991 book, Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, which showed that the English Civil War, the Fronde, the Ming-Qing transition, the French Revolution, and the Ottoman crises all shared a common structural demographic mechanism, and he had the mathematical tools to test whether the pattern held. I need to explain Goldstone for a moment, because he is the bridge between a 14th century theory and a 21st century equation. In 1991, Goldstone, a sociologist at George Mason University, published a book that analyzed state breakdowns across 5 centuries and multiple continents. He showed that revolutions and major political crises were not caused by ideology or by the ambitions of specific leaders, or by any of the things that conventional political history emphasizes. They were caused by a specific combination of demographic pressure, elite overproduction, and state fiscal distress that recurred in every case he examined. Population growth outpacing economic capacity, too many elites competing for too few positions of power, state budgets strained past the breaking point. When all three hit simultaneously, the state collapsed. Every time. The American Sociological Association gave the book its Distinguished Scholarly Publication Award. And then, like Khaldun before him, Goldstone was largely sidelined by mainstream historians because the implication of his work, like the implication of Khaldun's, was that civilizational collapse is not a failure of leadership. It is a structural inevitability that follows from measurable conditions. And that is not a conclusion that the people running civilizations want to accept. Turchin took Goldstone's framework, combined it with Khaldun's Asabiyyah model, and added two things neither of them had. First, a specific hypothesis about how Asabiyyah is generated in the first place. Khaldun had said it came from desert hardship. Turchin generalized this with what he calls the meta-ethnic frontier hypothesis. He argued, in War and Peace and War, published in 2006, that high cohesion societies arise not just from hardship in general, but specifically from prolonged, intense conflict on cultural frontiers, places where radically different ethnic and religious groups collide. Rome's Asabiyyah was forged on the Latin Celtic frontier. Russia's was forged on the steppe frontier with the Tatars and Mongols. The United States, Turchin argued, had its Asabiyyah forged on the frontier with Native Americans, a centuries-long conflict that produced a cohesive national identity through shared danger. The meta-ethnic frontier is the crucible. And once the frontier closes, once the external threat recedes, the cohesion begins its long decay. That reframing is important because it means Asabiyyah is not renewable on demand. You cannot generate it through education or propaganda or national service programs. It is forged in existential conflict, and you cannot manufacture existential conflict without the conflict actually being existential. The second thing Turchin added was data. Massive amounts of data. In 2003, he published Historical Dynamics through Princeton University Press, the first quantitative Cliodynamics text. Cliodynamics. He named the field after Clio, the Greek muse of history. It was a deliberate provocation. He was claiming that history could be made scientific, that the same mathematical rigor applied to physics and biology could be applied to the rise and fall of civilizations. Most historians considered this somewhere between naive and offensive. Turchin did not seem to mind. In 2006, he published War and Peace and War, the popular treatment which introduced the meta-ethnic frontier concept and explicitly credited Khaldun as the intellectual ancestor of the entire program. And in 2009, he and the Russian historian Sergei Nefedov published Secular Cycles, also through Princeton, which is the empirical heart of the entire program, and the book that if you read one work of Cliodynamics, should be it. Secular Cycles tested the model against 8 specific historical cycles. I am going to list them because the specificity matters. This is not hand-waving. This is quantitative analysis of real data. The Plantagenet cycle in England, 1150 to 1485. They tracked wheat prices, real wages for building laborers, coin hoard frequencies as a proxy for social instability, and the number of recorded disturbances per decade. The data showed an integrative phase of population growth and rising wages through the 13th century, followed by a stagflation plateau as population pressed against carrying capacity, followed by a disintegrative phase marked by the Great Famine of 1315–17, the Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and the Wars of the Roses. The Tudor-Stuart cycle, 1485–1730. Same variables, same pattern. Integrative phase under the early Tudors. Stagflation by the late 16th century. Disintegrative phase, producing the English Civil War, the Interregnum, and the Glorious Revolution. The Capetian cycle in France, 1150–1450. The Valois cycle, 1450–1660. The Roman Republican cycle, 350–30 BCE. The Roman Principate cycle, 30 BCE to 285 CE. The Muscovy cycle in Russia, 1460–1620. And the Romanov cycle, 1620–1922. 8 cycles, 3 countries plus Rome, spanning nearly 2,000 years of human history. And the methodology was not impressionistic. They tracked specific quantitative variables, price data adjusted for inflation, real wage series, using the wages of building craftsmen and laborers documented in institutional records, population estimates from tax records, parish registers, and archaeological surveys. Elite numbers proxied through indicators like the percentage of the population holding noble titles, the ratio of landholding families, and the frequency of new peerage creations, and instability indices compiled from historical databases of recorded riots, rebellions, coups, and civil wars. Every cycle matched the model, an integrative phase of roughly 100 to 150 years, during which population grew, wages were decent, elites were few relative to available positions, and cohesion held. A stagflation plateau, where population growth slowed, wages stagnated, and the first signs of elite competition appeared. And then a disintegrative phase in which elite overproduction and popular immiseration combined to produce crisis. The crisis typically lasted several decades, involving widespread political violence, state fiscal collapse, and either the destruction of the existing political order or its radical reformation. The typical secular cycle in agrarian societies, they found, runs 200 to 300 years. That is longer than Khaldun's 120 years, but the discrepancy is illuminating rather than damaging. Khaldun was looking at dynasties, specific ruling families and their tribal supporters. Turchin and Nefedov were looking at entire societal cycles, which can contain multiple dynasties. The dynasty turns over every 3 to 4 generations. The society cycles over a longer period. The Khaldunian mechanism is the engine inside the larger machine. And Turchin's innovation was to show that within each secular cycle, there are shorter oscillations of approximately 50 years, which he calls the fathers and sons cycle, driven by intergenerational shifts in social mood. A generation experiences crisis and violence. The next generation, scarred by the memory, avoids confrontation and seeks stability. The third generation, with no memory of the crisis, allows the structural pressures to rebuild. The fourth generation inherits the accumulated pressure and the cycle spikes again. The 50-year cycle is the heartbeat inside the larger wave. And when you overlay both the Khaldunian macro cycle and the 50-year microcycle, the pattern matches historical instability data with a precision that makes most historians deeply uncomfortable. Not because the fit is approximate, because the fit is too good, because a model built by a 14th century North African scholar, extended by a 21st century population biologist, and tested against data from societies that neither of them ever visited, produces results that should not work if history is truly the product of contingency and individual choice. And yet it works. But Turchin did not stop at pre-modern societies. He built a database, the Seshat Global History Databank, founded in 2011, is an international collaboration led by Turchin, Harvey Whitehouse at Oxford, Peter Francois at Oxford, and Daniel Hoyer at the Evolution Institute. Its current codebook contains 383 variables with roughly 36,000 data points across more than 600 polities. It covers everything from independent villages and chiefdoms to vast empires, from the Neolithic to the Industrial Revolution. In 2018, the team published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that 9 measures of social complexity, population, territory, hierarchy, government sophistication, infrastructure, information systems, money, and others, all co-evolve along a single underlying dimension. Social complexity is not a grab bag. It is a coherent variable. It moves as one. And then Turchin did something that scientists almost never do. He used the model to make a prediction, not a retroactive fit, not a post hoc explanation, a prediction about the future, published in a peer-reviewed journal with a specific timeline. And he did it not because he was confident, but because he believed that making testable predictions is the only way to separate science from storytelling. He later wrote on his website that the results for the USA scared him. That is a direct quote from Turchin's own account. The results scared him, and he sent them to nature anyway, because a scientific theory that cannot be tested is not a theory. In Nature, volume 463, page 608, February 4th, 2010, he wrote that quantitative historical analysis reveals that complex human societies are affected by recurrent, unpredictable waves of political instability. He said the next decade was likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe. He named the specific structural demographic forces. In the United States, he wrote, "We have stagnating or declining real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees, and exploding public debt." He said that in the United States, 50-year instability spikes occurred around 1870, 1920, and 1970. So another could be due around 2020. He also wrote something that gets quoted less often, but may be more important. He wrote that records show that societies can avert disaster and that we need to find ways to ameliorate the negative effects of globalization on people's well-being. The man was not rooting for collapse. He was trying to prevent it. The distinction matters. And then he waited for 10 years while the country he had warned about moved in exactly the direction his model predicted. In 2016, he published Ages of Discord, which applied the full structural demographic framework to American history. He identified 2 macrocycles. The first ran from roughly 1780 to 1930, peaking in violence around the Civil War. The second began with the New Deal integrative phase, peaked in well-being and equality around 1960, and entered its disintegrative phase in the 1970s. Inside the second macrocycle, the 50-year fathers and sons oscillation had produced instability spikes around 1870, around 1920, around 1970, and the model predicted around 2020. In August of 2020, Turchin and his colleague Andrei Korotayev published a retrospective assessment of the 2010 prediction in PLOS 1, Volume 15, Number 8. The paper is titled The 2010 Structural Demographic Forecast for the 2010 to 2020 Decade, a retrospective assessment. It is freely available online. I would encourage you to read it because the dispassionate tone of the paper makes its findings even more disturbing than if the authors had been alarmist. They are not alarmist. They are clinical. They use the cross-national time series data archive to measure political instability across the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Spain between 1960 and 2020. Germany was excluded because the 1990 reunification breaks the time series. The results were unambiguous. The incidence per year of both non-violent anti-government demonstrations and violent riots increased by an order of magnitude in the United States after 2010. Not a small increase, not a doubling. An order of magnitude, a tenfold spike in political instability events, arriving exactly when the model said it would. The same pattern appeared in the UK, France, Italy, and Spain. And I want to underscore what a tenfold spike means in human terms, because the clinical language of the paper obscures the reality. A tenfold increase in political instability events means 10 times as many people in the streets, 10 times as many confrontations with police, 10 times as many buildings burned, businesses destroyed, lives disrupted. It means a society that was, by the metrics of political stability, relatively calm in 2005 had become, by 2020, a society in which large-scale political destruction was a routine occurrence. The George Floyd protests of 2020 involved an estimated 15 to 26 million participants across the United States, making them the largest protests in American history. The January 6th insurrection involved thousands of people breaching the Capitol building. These are not statistical abstractions. These are real events involving real people acting out roles that the model predicted they would act out, based on structural conditions that were measured and tracked for decades before the events occurred. And I want to be precise about what made this prediction unusual, because this is the part that separates Turchin from the pundits and the doomers and the people who vaguely predict that things are going to get worse. Turchin's 2020 retrospective paper explicitly notes that the 2010 forecast was not a linear extrapolation of current trends. On the contrary, he writes, it predicted a trend reversal. Political instability in the United States had been declining through the 2000s. Things were, by the metrics he was tracking, getting calmer. His model said the calm was temporary, that the structural pressures were accumulating beneath the surface, and that the explosion would come around 2020 regardless of what the surface looked like in 2010. The explosion came. That is not a lucky guess. That is a model that captures something real about how civilizations work, and the resistance to it, the persistent refusal of mainstream academia to engage with Cliodynamics as a serious research program, is itself a data point in the model. Because what Turchin's critics object to is not his data. They rarely dispute the data. What they object to is the implication. They object to the idea that history has patterns that constrain individual agency. They object to the suggestion that the choices made by political leaders are less important than the structural conditions those leaders inherit. They object, at the deepest level, to the possibility that human societies might be subject to something resembling natural law, because that possibility is incompatible with the foundational assumption of Western liberal democracy, which is that we choose our future. I should be honest about the critics, because intellectual honesty requires it, and because the Fault Lines audience will fact-check me if I am not. Turchin's program is contested. Daniel Bessner and other scholars have argued in Compact magazine that the concept of elite overproduction suffers from conceptual vagueness, that it is difficult to define precisely who counts as an elite aspirant and who does not. Aguiar, in a 2023 PLOS 1 paper, replicated Turchin's PSI computations, but argued that the empirical drivers of the rising index do not match the mechanism Turchin specifies. Mainstream historians continue to resist the entire enterprise of quantitative pattern seeking in history, arguing that each historical event is unique and that pattern matching across cultures and centuries inevitably distorts the specificity that makes history meaningful. These are not trivial objections. The boundary problem, who counts as an elite, is real. The replication question, do the equations actually capture what they claim to capture, is legitimate. And the philosophical objection that treating history as law-like denies the role of contingency and individual choice is the deepest of all. But here is what I keep coming back to. Turchin made a prediction, a specific, quantitative, falsifiable prediction. He published it in the most prestigious scientific journal on Earth, with a specific timeline, a decade before the events he predicted. And the events arrived on schedule. If the theory were wrong, the prediction should have failed. It did not fail. You can argue with the conceptual framework. You can question the variable definitions. You can object philosophically to the entire enterprise, but you cannot argue with the fact that the model produced a correct prediction about a complex social system, published in advance, confirmed by data. That is the kind of evidence that, in any other field, would settle the argument. The fact that it has not settled the argument in history tells you something about the field, and it tells you something about the depth of the resistance to what the argument implies. But here is where it gets worse, because the prediction was not the end of the analysis. The prediction was the beginning. The question the prediction raises, the question that Turchin's entire body of work builds toward, is not whether the model works. The data says it works. The question is what happens next. And the answer to that question is where Khaldun's algorithm stops being an intellectual exercise and starts being a personal threat. I need to walk you through the mechanics now, because the mechanics are what separate this from the kind of vague, civilizational pessimism that you can get from any op-ed page. The mechanics are specific. They are mathematical. They tell you exactly which variables to track and what it means when they move. Turchin formalized the mechanism using something he calls the political stress indicator, which I am going to walk you through because the equation itself is more revealing than any summary I could give you. The political stress indicator, abbreviated PSI, is the product of three terms: mass mobilization potential times elite mobilization potential times state fiscal distress. Notice that it is multiplicative, not additive. That matters. If any one of the three terms is near zero, the overall PSI stays low regardless of the other two. A society with severe elite overproduction, but a well-paid general population and a trusted government can muddle through. A society with declining wages, but a small, cohesive elite and a fiscally sound government can absorb the stress. But when all three terms spike simultaneously, when ordinary people are suffering and elites are fighting each other and the state is broke and distrusted, the product goes exponential. The system does not degrade linearly. It breaks. Mass mobilization potential measures how desperate the general population is. It is driven by the inverse of the relative wage, meaning median wages divided by GDP per capita. So when wages stagnate while GDP grows, this term increases. It also includes the urbanization rate and the size of the 20 to 29-year-old youth cohort. When young, urban, economically frustrated people accumulate, mass mobilization potential spikes. This is Khaldun's popular immiseration channel, the moment when the people being taxed realize they are receiving nothing in return. Elite mobilization potential measures how many people are competing for elite positions that do not exist. It is driven by the inverse of relative elite income and the ratio of elite aspirants to actual positions of power. When a society produces far more lawyers, MBAs, PhD holders, and would-be politicians than the system can absorb, those frustrated aspirants become what Turchin calls counter-elites. They have the education, the connections, and the ambition to lead, but no path to power within the existing structure. So they seek power outside it. They become populist leaders, revolutionary figures, or simply agents of institutional destruction. This is Khaldun's luxury, produces too many princes channel. The third and fourth generation of the dynasty producing more claimants than the kingdom can accommodate. State fiscal distress measures how broken the government's finances are. It is national debt scaled to GDP, multiplied by 1 minus the share of the public that trusts the government. When debt is high and trust is low, the state cannot mobilize resources to address the crisis because the people no longer believe the state is acting in their interest. This is Khaldun's final stage, the dynasty that retains the form of authority without its substance, decrees that nobody follows, institutions that nobody trusts, a government that collects taxes and provides nothing the population values. 3 terms, 3 channels. All 3 mapped directly onto Khaldun's original model, 600 years later, expressed as a multiplicative equation. When any one of the 3 is low, the PSI stays manageable. When all 3 spike simultaneously, the system breaks. Now let me show you what happens when you run the American data through this equation. Because the numbers are specific, they are published, they are sourced, and they match the late-stage profile on every single variable. Start with income inequality. The United States Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality, was 0.394 in 1970. By 2021, it was 0.494. That is a 25% increase in income concentration over 50 years. The top 1% share of earnings nearly doubled, from 7.3% in 1979 to 13.2% in 2019, according to the Economic Policy Institute. The top 0.1% saw their earnings rise from $648,000 to $2.9 million in real terms, a 345% increase. And the number that Turchin highlights in End Times, published by Penguin in 2023, is the number of decamillionaire households, meaning households worth $10 million or more. In 1983, there were 66,000 of them in the United States. By 2019, there were 693,000, more than a 10-fold increase. In the same period, the total number of American households grew by 53%. The wealth did not spread, it concentrated. That is the wealth pump. That is Khaldun's luxury phase. Now, real wages. From the end of World War II through 1978, median worker compensation tracked GDP growth. In some years, it outpaced it. Workers were getting richer as the economy grew. After 1978, the lines diverged. GDP per capita grew another 70% by 2012. Production worker wages stagnated. Unskilled wages actually fell by roughly 10% in real terms. Turchin's relative wage measure, which is the ratio of median wage to GDP per capita, peaked in 1976 to 78 and has roughly halved since then. The wealth pump, the mechanism by which economic growth is redirected from the general population to the elite, switched on in the late 1970s and has been running at full capacity ever since. That is not speculation. That is Bureau of Labor Statistics data, plotted against Bureau of Economic Analysis GDP numbers. The lines are public. Anyone can look at them. Almost nobody talks about what they mean in the context of Khaldun's model. Now, elite overproduction. This is the variable that Turchin considers most dangerous, and it maps most directly onto Khaldun's description of the fourth generation producing more claimants than the kingdom can support. Between the mid-1970s and 2011, the number of lawyers in the United States tripled from 400,000 to 1.2 million. The population grew by 45%. The ratio of lawyers per thousand people went from 1.6 to 3.9. Economic Modeling Specialists International estimated that the economy was producing 25,000 surplus law graduates per year, meaning graduates for whom no law job existed. And this is just the most measurable edge of a much larger phenomenon. Consider what happens when a society produces far more credentialed, ambitious, politically aware individuals than the system can absorb. They do not quietly accept downward mobility. They have been trained to expect positions of influence. They have the skills to organize, communicate, and build coalitions. And when the conventional path to power is blocked, they seek unconventional paths. They become populist leaders. They become media personalities. They become movement builders. They become the leaders of protest movements. Some of them become revolutionaries. The French Revolution was not led by peasants. It was led by frustrated lawyers, minor nobles, and credentialed professionals who believed they deserved a role in governance that the ancien regime would not give them. The Russian Revolution was not led by workers. It was led by educated radicals from the professional class who had been radicalized by the gap between their expectations and their opportunities. Turchin tracks another metric that is harder to quantify but equally telling: the number of self-funded political candidates contributing $1 million or more to their own campaigns. In the entire decade of the 1990s, there was one. In the 2020 election cycle, there were 36. That is not a shift in political culture. That is a mathematical signature. It is the system producing more aspiring elites than it can absorb, and those unabsorbed elites using personal wealth to force their way into positions of power. It is Khaldun's fourth generation, the generation of senility, trying to buy what earlier generations earned through solidarity. And the fact that it is happening across the political spectrum, on the left and the right, among Democrats and Republicans alike, tells you that it is not ideological. It is structural. It is the algorithm. Now, social mobility. In 2017, a team led by Raj Chetty at Stanford published a paper in Science titled The Fading American Dream. The methodology was precise. They linked federal tax records for parents and children across multiple birth cohorts, comparing children's household income at age 30 to their parents' household income at the same age, all in inflation-adjusted dollars. They found that the share of American children who earned more than their parents at age 30 had fallen from 92% for the 1940 birth cohort to 50% for the 1984 birth cohort, 92% to 50%. In one generation. The American dream, the idea that each generation will do better than the last, went from near universal reality to a coin flip, and roughly 2/3 of the decline was attributable to rising inequality, not slower growth. The pie was still growing. The slices were just being cut differently. The economy was producing more wealth than ever. The wealth pump was simply redirecting it upward faster than the economy could grow, and the people at the bottom were running to stay in place while the ground beneath them accelerated in the wrong direction. I want you to think about what that number means in terms of Khaldun's theory. 92% to 50%. That is a society in which virtually every child used to have a path upward, and now half of them do not. That is the transition from the integrative phase to the disintegrative phase, measured not in abstract economic indicators, but in the lived experience of millions of families who played by the rules and found that the rules had been rewritten without their knowledge. That is the dissolution of the implicit social contract that held American society together. You work hard, you play fair, your children do better. When that contract holds for 92% of the population, you have Asabiyyah. When it holds for 50%, you have a society divided between those who still believe the system works and those who know from personal experience that it does not. And the 50% who know it does not work are the raw material for every destabilizing force in Turchin's model. And finally, institutional trust. This is the variable that connects most directly to Khaldun's concept of Asabiyyah, because institutional trust is the modern proxy for the group solidarity he described. When you trust your institutions, you are expressing a belief that the collective enterprise works, that the people running it are acting in the shared interest, that the system deserves your loyalty. When trust collapses, that belief is gone, and what replaces it is not apathy. What replaces it is the conviction that the system is being run for the benefit of people who are not you. That conviction is the psychological ground state of every revolution in Turchin's database. Gallup has been tracking public confidence in American institutions since 1973. The trend lines are not ambiguous. They are a slope going in one direction. In 2022, Congress hit 7%. 7% of the American public expressed confidence in the United States Congress. Think about what that means functionally. 93% of the people living in a republic do not trust the central institution of Republican government. The presidency was at 23%. The Supreme Court was at 25%. The criminal justice system was at 14%. Public schools were at 28%. Large corporations were at 14%. Newspapers were at 16%. Television news was at 11%. You can scan the entire list of Gallup-tracked institutions, and the only ones that retain majority confidence are small business and the military. Everything else is below 50%. Many are below 20%. Pew Research Center, in July of 2023, surveying 8,480 adults, found that just 16% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing, just about always or most of the time. 16%. That is not a dip. That is not a rough patch. That is a structural transformation. In 1958, when the National Election Study first asked the question, the number was 73%. From 73% to 16%. Over 65 years, the American public went from overwhelming trust in its own government to overwhelming distrust. And the decline was not linear. It plateaued in the 80s and 90s, then accelerated sharply after 2000. The curve looks like the disintegrative phase of a secular cycle, because that is what it is. And the trend is accelerating. Gallup found that confidence in the United States judicial system fell from 59% in 2020 to 35% by 2024. A 24-point collapse in 4 years. That is not generational drift. That is a crisis of legitimacy in real time. The gap between American confidence in courts and the OECD median opened to 20 points, the largest in Gallup's trend. Across the developed world, court confidence was stable. In the United States, it fell off a cliff. And the people who should be alarmed by that, the people whose authority depends on institutional legitimacy, are behaving exactly the way Khaldun's fourth generation behaves. They are issuing decrees and expecting compliance. not understanding that compliance is a function of legitimacy, and that legitimacy is a function of trust, and that trust has left the building. Congressional polarization, measured by the DW Nominate roll call voting scores developed by Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, is at the highest level since the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s. Democrats and Republicans in Congress are further apart ideologically than at any point in the past 50 years. And that polarization is not caused by social media. It is not caused by cable news. It is not caused by any of the things that the surface-level conversation attributes it to. In Turchin's framework, polarization is a symptom of elite overproduction. Too many aspiring elites competing for too few positions create factions. The factions weaponize popular grievance to build power bases. The platforms, the media ecosystems are accelerants. They are not the ignition source. The ignition source is structural. It is demographic. It is, if Khaldun is right, thermodynamic. I want to pause here and correct something that you might be thinking, because it is the most common misconception about this entire framework, and correcting it is the difference between understanding what Khaldun and Turchin are actually saying, and filing this away as generic doomer content. The misconception is that the current crisis is caused by bad actors, by corrupt politicians, by greedy billionaires, by a specific party or ideology. The structural demographic model says something different. It says the crisis is caused by the system working exactly as designed. The wealth pump is not a bug. It is a feature that activates when the conditions are right. Elite overproduction is not a moral failure. It is what happens when a society successfully educates large numbers of ambitious people without expanding the number of positions those people can fill. Trust collapse is not caused by bad institutions. It is caused by good institutions that were built by one generation and inherited by another that cannot maintain them. The decay is built into the success. That is the trap. That is the algorithm. You might think, at this point, that the historical survival rate from a fully developed disintegrative phase would be the next logical question. You would be right. And the answer is where Khaldun's algorithm stops being uncomfortable and starts being terrifying. Turchin's CrisisDB project has catalogued roughly 300 historical crises. About 100 of those have high-quality data, meaning enough surviving records to reconstruct the trajectory from onset to resolution. I gave you the numbers at the beginning of this script. Now I am going to give you the context. 75% of those crises ended in revolution, civil war, or both. Not peaceful reform, not managed transition. Violence. Sustained, organized, politically motivated violence. 60% of exits resulted in the death of the state. The state was conquered by a neighbor, or it fragmented into pieces, or its central government simply ceased to function. Those are not fringe outcomes. Those are the dominant outcomes. The baseline historical result of a fully developed disintegrative phase is not recovery. It is catastrophe. And the numbers get worse the deeper you look. In 1/5 of the cases, roughly 20%, the crisis did not end with a single episode of violence. It produced recurrent civil wars that dragged on for a century or longer, 100 years of intermittent societal collapse. The late Roman Republic bled for a century. The English Wars of the Roses lasted 32 years. The French Wars of Religion lasted 36 years and were followed by the Fronde within a generation. Those are not outliers. That is 1 in 5. I need to pause here and make sure the weight of this is registering, because these numbers are not theoretical. They are not projections. They are body counts. Every one of those 300 crises involved real people, real families, real communities that were destroyed by political violence that followed a pattern they could not see and would not have believed if someone had described it to them. The Roman senator who voted against land reform in 133 BCE was not thinking about secular cycles. The French nobleman who resisted taxation under Louis XVI was not consulting a structural demographic model. They were making rational decisions within the incentive structures available to them. And those rational decisions, aggregated across millions of individuals, produced exactly the outcome the model predicts. That is what makes the algorithm so disturbing. It does not require villains. It runs on rational actors. But there are exceptions. There are cases where a society entered a disintegrative phase and pulled out of it without the state dying. And Turchin is careful to study those cases, because they are the ones that matter if you are looking for an exit. The most prominent example in American history is the Progressive Era, followed by the New Deal. The period from roughly 1901 to 1945, during which the United States experienced what Turchin calls an integrative revolution, not a violent revolution, a structural reform. And the specifics matter here, because they are not the vague generalities that most discussions of reform traffic in. Progressive taxation was introduced with the 16th Amendment in 1913. The top marginal tax rate went from 7% in 1913 to 77% by 1918, and would eventually reach 94% during World War II. Antitrust enforcement, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt's prosecution of Northern Securities Company in 1902, broke up the monopolies that had concentrated wealth in the Gilded Age. Labor protections, from the establishment of the Department of Labor in 1913 to the Wagner Act of 1935, gave workers collective bargaining power that partially offset the wealth pump. Social Security, signed into law in 1935, created a floor beneath which the elderly could not fall. The GI Bill, signed in 1944, funded college education for 8 million returning veterans, creating the largest expansion of the middle class in American history. These were not gestures. They were structural interventions that directly addressed the 3 terms of Turchin's political stress indicator. Progressive taxation and antitrust reduced elite overproduction by shrinking the wealth gap and limiting the number of people who could accumulate dynastic fortunes. Labor protections and the GI Bill reduced mass mobilization potential by raising real wages and expanding economic opportunity. Social Security and public investment rebuilt state legitimacy by demonstrating that the government served the interests of ordinary citizens. The wealth pump was not shut off entirely, but it was throttled, and the results were measurable. Real wages rose, social mobility increased, income inequality fell, the Gini coefficient dropped from the Gilded Age highs to the post-war lows. Institutional trust rebuilt. The disintegrative pressures that had been building since the 1870s were relieved, and the relief lasted roughly 3 decades, from the late 1930s to the late 1960s, before the pressures began to rebuild. But here is the part that keeps me up at night, and I think the reason Turchin titled his 2023 book End Times rather than something more measured. The Progressive Era and New Deal reforms required something specific. They required elite consensus, not total agreement, not the absence of opposition, but a sufficient critical mass of the elite class, recognizing that the system was approaching a breaking point and choosing to sacrifice short-term advantage for long-term stability. Theodore Roosevelt was a rich man who chose to regulate other rich men. Franklin Roosevelt was a patrician who chose to tax patricians. The New Deal was not imposed on the elite from outside. It was imposed on the elite by the elite by a faction within the elite that understood the alternative was worse. And that is the trap, because the structural demographic model predicts that by the time the crisis is severe enough to demand a reform of that magnitude, the same forces that created the crisis have already destroyed the capacity for the kind of collective action that reform requires. Asabiyyah is gone. Trust is gone. Elite consensus is gone. The counter-elites, the frustrated aspirants produced by elite overproduction, are not interested in reform. They are interested in replacing the existing elite. They do not want to fix the system. They want to capture it. And the existing elite, whose wealth depends on the wealth pump continuing to operate, will resist any reform that threatens their position. Not because they are evil, because they are rational actors responding to incentives, exactly the way Khaldun said they would, exactly the way every fourth generation in every dynasty he ever studied responded to the same incentives. The algorithm does not require bad people. It runs on ordinary human behavior, operating inside a structure that channels ordinary behavior toward collapse. And this is the part where I need to be honest about my own reaction to the material, because the ultimate hack framework I work within says that I should occasionally admit uncertainty or personal struggle, and this is not a performative admission. I genuinely do not know how to think about the political implications of what Turchin's data shows, because the data does not care about your politics. It does not care whether you are left or right, progressive or conservative, populist or establishment. The model predicts that all political factions in a disintegrative phase are performing roles that the algorithm has assigned them. The populist demagogue is a predicted product of elite overproduction, a counter-elite weaponizing popular grievance to seize power. The establishment centrist is a predicted product of elite entrenchment, defending the existing order because reform threatens their position. The radical activist is a predicted product of mass mobilization potential, a young, educated, economically frustrated person channeling structural anger into political action. Every actor believes they are making free choices. The model suggests they are running a script that was written by the structural conditions they were born into. That is not a comfortable thing to think about. It is not a comfortable thing to say. And it is the exact kind of conclusion that the institutional mainstream, left and right, would prefer not to engage with, because it delegitimizes everyone equally. It says the problem is not your opponents. The problem is the system that produces both you and your opponents. And the solution, if one exists, is not to defeat the other side. The solution is to change the structural conditions that made both sides inevitable. Which brings us back to the question of whether that is possible. I want to take you through the historical parallels quickly, because the pattern is so consistent across civilizations that Khaldun never knew about, that it stops being coincidental and starts being something else entirely. The Roman Republic. Turchin and Nefedov analyzed the Republican cycle from 350 to 30 BCE in secular cycles. The integrative phase coincided with the early Republic and the Punic Wars, when Roman farmers served as citizen soldiers, when land ownership was broadly distributed, and when the Republic's Asabiyyah was forged on the Latin Celtic frontier. Roman legions were not professional armies. They were communities in arms. A Roman soldier owned land, voted in assemblies, and fought for a republic that he had a material stake in defending. That was Asabiyyah. That was the first generation. The disintegrative phase began in the 2nd century BCE, as conquest brought wealth that concentrated in the hands of large landholders. Cheap grain from Sicily and North Africa undercut Italian farmers. Wealthy senators bought up the abandoned small holdings and worked them with enslaved labor. The peasant soldiers who had built the republic were displaced from their land and drifted into the cities, where they became a restless, urban proletariat with no property and no stake in the system. The Gracchan crisis of the 130s and 120s BCE was the first visible symptom, the political equivalent of Turchin's fathers and sons spike. Tiberius Gracchus proposed land reform in 133 BCE. The Senate had him murdered. His brother Gaius tried again a decade later. The Senate had him murdered too. The message was clear. The elite would not voluntarily surrender the wealth pump. And from that point on, the Republic's trajectory matched Khaldun's model with almost eerie precision. Marius's military reforms created professional armies loyal to generals, not the state. Sulla marched on Rome. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The civil wars of the 1st century BCE were the full disintegrative collapse. Augustus's settlement created a new dynasty, the Principate, which started its own cycle from scratch. New Asabiyyah, new integrative phase, and eventually, centuries later, the same decay. The 3rd century crisis, the military anarchy, the identical pattern. The British Empire. If you date the cycle from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 or the Act of Union with Scotland in 1707, the pattern is visible. Cohesion forged on Atlantic and imperial frontiers. The British sense of collective identity was built not in the comfortable counties of southern England, but in the borderlands, the Scottish frontier, the Irish campaigns, the colonial conflicts with France and Spain, peak under the Pax Britannica, 1815 to 1914. A century of unquestioned naval dominance and imperial expansion that produced extraordinary wealth, which produced extraordinary inequality, which produced extraordinary complacency. The British elite of the late Victorian era were Khaldun's 3rd generation, men born into luxury, administering an empire they did not build, confident in institutions they did not have to fight for. Fiscal exhaustion in 2 world wars drained the treasury. Suez in 1956, when Britain and France tried to seize the canal and were humiliated by American diplomatic opposition, was the moment the form of imperial authority was exposed as hollow. The dynasty issued a decree. The decree was ignored from founding to dissolution, roughly 250 to 270 years, 2 secular cycles, or 1 full imperial life cycle, depending on how you count. The Soviet Union. And this is where a misconception needs correcting, because the conventional Western narrative treats the Soviet collapse as an ideological failure. Communism did not work, the story goes, and so the Soviet Union fell. Turchin's framework says something different. It says the Soviet Union followed the Khaldunian cycle in compressed form. Revolutionary Asabiyyah, forged in the Civil War of 1917 to 22, when a group of committed Bolsheviks, bound together by shared danger, persecution, and ideological solidarity, overthrew the Romanov dynasty whose own Asabiyyah had been decaying since the mid-19th century. Consolidation under Stalin, brutal and effective, centralizing power with the ruthlessness of Khaldun's 2nd generation. The Stalinist generation built the institutions, the industrial base, the military capacity. They also murdered millions. But the structural demographic model does not measure morality. It measures cohesion. And Stalin's Soviet Union, whatever its horrors, was cohesive. Then, luxury. Not luxury in the Western consumer sense, but luxury in the Khaldunian sense, meaning the replacement of earned solidarity with inherited privilege. Under Brezhnev, 1964 to 82, the Soviet elite became the nomenklatura, a class of privileged bureaucrats who had access to special shops, dakas, foreign goods, and educational opportunities that ordinary Soviet citizens could not touch. They were Khaldun's third generation, living off the revolutionary capital of their grandparents, defending a system they no longer believed in, managing an empire through inertia rather than conviction. And the final generation, the Politburo of the early 1980s, Chernenko and Andropov, and the gerontocracy, retaining the form of authority without its substance, issuing decrees from hospital beds, presiding over an economy that had stopped growing, and a military that consumed a quarter of GDP. The form of the state was intact. The Asabiyyah was gone. From the October Revolution to dissolution in 1991, 74 years, 3 generations, almost exactly. Khaldun's model does not care about ideology. It does not care whether the dynasty calls itself communist or capitalist, or feudal or democratic. It cares about one thing: cohesion decays the same way regardless of the label on the building. And the contemporary United States. Turchin dates the current disintegrative phase from approximately 1970 to the present. The integrative phase ran from the New Deal through the 1950s, peaking in well-being and equality around 1960. That year, 1960, is the hinge. If you look at the data, on almost every metric that matters, 1960 is the top of the curve. Real wages relative to GDP, highest around 1960. Income inequality, lowest around 1960. Social mobility, highest for cohorts born around 1940, who came of age around 1960. Institutional trust, Gallup begins measuring in 1973. But retrospective surveys suggest the peak was in the early to mid-1960s, when roughly 77% of Americans trusted the federal government. Everything after 1960 is descent, not immediately visible, not initially alarming, but consistent. Year after year, decade after decade, every variable moving in the direction that the model says leads to crisis. The wealth pump switched on in the late 1970s. There is a specific policy inflection point that Turchin and other researchers identify: the deregulation era that began under Carter and accelerated under Reagan. The breaking of the Air Traffic Controllers Union in 1981 as a signal that labor's bargaining power was being structurally reduced. The tax reforms of 1981 and 86 that cut top marginal rates from 70% to 28%. The financial deregulation that produced the savings and loan crisis, and eventually the 2008 financial crisis. None of these were described at the time as activating the wealth pump. They were described as promoting growth, reducing regulation, increasing efficiency. And they did promote growth. The GDP grew, the economy expanded, but the growth was captured by the top of the distribution, and the mechanism by which growth had previously been shared, strong unions, progressive taxation, regulated financial markets, was systematically dismantled. The wealth pump did not turn on by accident. It was engineered, not by conspirators, but by rational actors responding to incentives, which is how the algorithm always works. Real wages decoupled from GDP. Inequality began its long climb. Elite overproduction accelerated. Institutional trust began its collapse. And the 50-year fathers and sons cycle produced instability spikes around 1870, around 1920, around 1970, and 2020. 4 spikes, each one falling within the range Khaldun predicted, each one arriving on the schedule Turchin's equations calculated. So the question that remains, the question that the entire script has been building toward, is whether the algorithm can be broken, whether knowing the pattern changes the outcome, whether awareness is an escape route. Turchin believes it can be. In End Times, published by Penguin in 2023, he argues that the wealth pump must be shut down, progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, expansion of economic opportunity to absorb the surplus of elite aspirants. He models his prescription on the Progressive Era and the New Deal. He argues that the historical record provides a template, that the United States has done this before, that the structural demographic pressures of the Gilded Age were at least as severe as the current pressures, and that a reform movement led by a faction of the elite successfully reversed the disintegrative phase. But then you look at the conditions that made the Progressive Era and New Deal possible, and you look at the conditions that exist today, and the gap is the size of the argument. The Progressive Era succeeded because the elite class still shared enough common identity, enough Asabiyyah, to recognize their collective interest in reform. There were enough Roosevelts, enough patricians who understood that the alternative to reform was revolution, and who preferred giving up a portion of their wealth to losing everything. The political system, despite its corruption, was functional enough to translate elite consensus into policy. The media ecosystem, despite its biases, was coherent enough to build public support for reform. And the reform itself, while painful for some elites, did not require dismantling the system that produced elite power. It required adjusting the distribution. Now look at the current conditions. Elite polarization at post-Reconstruction highs, institutional trust at all-time lows, a media ecosystem fragmented into partisan silos that make consensus not just difficult, but structurally impossible. A political system in which the cost of running for office has become so extreme that only the wealthy or the backed by the wealthy can participate, meaning the reform must come from the very class that benefits from the current arrangement. And counter-elites, produced by decades of elite overproduction, who have no interest in reform, because reform would mean accepting a system that already denied them access. And here is the cruelest part of the algorithm. The conditions that made the Progressive Era possible were themselves a product of a specific historical moment that cannot be replicated. The Progressive Era happened during a period when American Asabiyyah, while declining, had not yet collapsed. There was still enough shared national identity, enough common understanding of what it meant to be American, to form a coalition across class lines. Roosevelt could appeal to a sense of national solidarity that transcended individual economic interest. There was still enough trust in the federal government, despite the corruption of the Gilded Age, for the public to believe that reform could work. And critically, the external threat environment, 2 world wars and the Cold War, provided a substitute for the meta-ethnic frontier that had originally forged American cohesion. When the nation faces an existential external threat, internal Asabiyyah temporarily spikes. The New Deal and post-war reforms were in part the product of wartime solidarity. Remove the external threat, and the internal cohesion fades. The contemporary United States faces no comparable external threat. There is no frontier. There is no existential military adversary that requires the kind of national mobilization that temporarily restores cohesion. What remains is a population that has been sorted by the algorithm into its late-stage configuration. Elites defending their position, counter-elites attacking the system that excluded them. A population that trusts neither the elites nor the counter-elites. And a state apparatus that is simultaneously too large to manage efficiently and too hollowed out to deliver the services that would rebuild legitimacy. Turchin himself acknowledges this. In his 2020 retrospective paper, he writes that societal crises, once they begin, can typically last 5 to 15 years. He uses the metaphor of predicting a forest fire from accumulated deadwood. You can predict the conflagration from the fuel load. You cannot predict the spark. But once the fire starts, the fuel load determines how large it grows and how long it burns. And the fuel load in the United States, by every metric Turchin tracks, is at its highest point since the Civil War. There is a term in Turchin's work that I have not yet used, and I have been saving it because I think it captures the structural trap better than anything else in the literature. He calls it the wealth pump, not as a metaphor, as a mechanical description. The wealth pump is the set of institutional arrangements, tax policies, labor laws, trade agreements, educational credentialing systems, and financial structures that together determine how economic growth is distributed between the elite and the general population. In the integrative phase, the wealth pump is either shut off or running in reverse, redistributing growth downward. In the disintegrative phase, the wealth pump runs upward, concentrating growth at the top. And the people who control the pump, the people who benefit from its direction, are the people who would have to shut it off. That is the trap. The reform requires the reformer to act against their own immediate economic interest. And the algorithm predicts, based on the behavior of elites, in every documented disintegrative phase across every civilization in the dataset, that they will not do this voluntarily. They will resist. They will resist until the pressure produces the one thing the algorithm predicts with 75% reliability. Violence. I want to return to Khaldun now, because the end of this story is not about equations. It is about a man. He wrote the Muqaddimah in a castle in Algeria, alone, after losing his career, his friends, his political standing, and his faith in the systems he had spent his life serving. He wrote it because he had seen the pattern so many times that he could no longer pretend it was accidental. He wrote it because the pattern had consumed everyone he had ever worked for, every dynasty he had ever served, every court that had ever employed him. And then, after writing it, he went back into the system. He moved to Cairo. He became a judge. He lost his family to the sea. He met the conqueror who embodied the very force his theory described. And he died knowing that the theory was correct, that the pattern would continue, and that knowing the pattern had not saved a single one of the civilizations he had lived inside. 600 years later, Peter Turchin translated the theory into equations. He tested it against data from more than 600 societies. He published a prediction in the most prestigious scientific journal on Earth. The prediction came true. The data was confirmed. The mechanism was validated. And the people who most need to understand it, the people inside the civilization that the algorithm is currently processing, continue to behave exactly the way the algorithm predicts they will. The elites resist reform. The counter-elites demand upheaval. The population loses trust. The state accrues debt it cannot service. And the cycle advances. Khaldun believed that awareness might be enough, that if you could see the pattern, you could intervene. Turchin believes something similar. He calls it the optimistic scenario. He says the data shows that reform is possible, that the progressive era proves it, that the cycle is not destiny. But the data also shows something else. It shows that the reform window is narrow. It shows that the conditions for reform, elite consensus, institutional functionality, sufficient remaining trust, are precisely the conditions that the disintegrative phase destroys. It shows that by the time a society recognizes the severity of its crisis, the tools needed to address the crisis have usually already been dismantled by the crisis itself. 75% of historical crises end in revolution or civil war. 60% end in the death of the state. And the factor that separates the societies that survived from the societies that did not was not awareness. It was not intelligence. It was not the presence of a thinker who understood the pattern. It was the presence of enough collective will, enough Asabiyyah, to act on the understanding before the window closed. Turchin was asked, after 2020, whether his prediction being correct gave him any satisfaction. He said, no. He said the satisfaction would have come if the prediction had caused people to act, and it did not. He said societal crises, once they begin, typically last 5 to 15 years. He said the United States is still in the early years of its crisis. He said the structural conditions have not changed. The wealth pump is still operating. Elite overproduction is still accelerating. Institutional trust is still declining. And the counter-elites, the frustrated aspirants whose ambitions the system cannot absorb, are still accumulating. He wrote, in the 2020 PLOS1 paper, a line that I keep coming back to. Records show that societies can avert disaster. We need to find ways to ameliorate the negative effects of globalization on people's well-being. Economic inequality, accompanied by burgeoning public debt, can be addressed by making tax rates more progressive. And we should not expand our system of higher education beyond the ability of the economy to absorb university graduates. That last line, we should not expand our system of higher education beyond the ability of the economy to absorb university graduates. That is not a line from a doom prophet. That is a line from an engineer reading a pressure gauge. He is not predicting the explosion. He is describing the conditions under which explosions occur and noting that the needle is in the red. Khaldun saw the fire. He named the fuel. He described the combustion cycle with a precision that held up for 6 centuries. And the fire burned anyway, not because he was wrong, because being right about the algorithm does not exempt you from being inside it. The algorithm does not need your ignorance to function. It does not need your cooperation. It does not need your consent. It runs on the same force it destroys. The cohesion that builds the civilization is the fuel. The success that the cohesion produces is the heat. And the heat is what makes the fuel burn. You do not escape a fire by understanding thermodynamics. You escape it by leaving the building. And the building, in this case, is the civilization itself. I want to end where this started. Not with Turchin's equations, not with the data, with a man in a castle in Algeria, 647 years ago, writing by lamplight, having lost his parents to plague, his freedom to prison, his friend to execution, and, not yet but soon, his family to the sea. He wrote because he had seen the pattern and could not unsee it. He wrote because he believed that naming the force might give someone, somewhere, the ability to resist it. He called the book an introduction, a prolegomenon, as if the real work, the work of using the knowledge to change the outcome, was something that would come later, that someone else would finish what he started. 647 years later, no one has finished it. The algorithm was discovered. It was validated. It was published in the most prestigious journals on Earth. It produced a prediction that came true on schedule. And the civilization that most needs to hear what it says continues to behave exactly the way the algorithm predicts it will. The elites resist reform because reform threatens their position. The counter-elites demand upheaval because the system has no room for them. The population loses trust because the institutions stopped serving them. The state accrues debt it cannot service because the alternative is admitting that the model has broken, and the cycle advances. The way it advanced for the Almoravids, the way it advanced for Rome, the way it advanced for the Soviets, the way it has advanced for every dynasty and every civilization that has ever reached the phase that the data says the United States is in right now. Khaldun understood this. He wrote it down in 1377. He titled a section on dynastic lifespan with a sentence that reads, like a clinical diagnosis. Dynasties have a natural lifespan, like individuals, not a metaphor, a statement of observed law. And then he went back into the system. He served more rulers. He lost more people. He met the conqueror who embodied the very force his theory described. And he died knowing that the theory was correct, that the pattern would continue, and that knowing the pattern had not saved a single one of the civilizations he had lived inside. The algorithm was discovered 700 years ago. It was confirmed by modern data. It is running now, and the question that Khaldun could not answer, the question that Turchin cannot answer, the question that the data across 300 crises and 600 societies and 8 secular cycles and 4 generations of decay has never once answered in the affirmative, is whether a civilization that sees the pattern can do the one thing the pattern says it cannot do: act together. Before the capacity to act together is the thing that has already been lost.